Proposition 5, this is an amendment to lower the supermajority requirement from 55% from 2/3 for local bond measures to fund housing and public infrastructure. That doesn't make any sense. Don't worry about it because I'll explain it. Essentially what it does is it lowers the voter approval threshold from 2/3 to 55% for local bond measures, specifically for funding housing projects and public infrastructure. So how did Proposition 5 get on the ballot? Once again, this is something that gets, because it's related to bond measures, it has to go to the California State Legislature first. And again, on this one, the Ballotpedia, which created this box, has a lower house listed as the California House of Representatives. It's really the California State Senate. And this is a proposition where there's clearly a partisan split. So if you look at the left-hand side, the California State Assembly, that they passed it first. The vote was 54 in favor, 48 against, and 17 not voting. But if you look down below that, you can see that all 54 Democrats who voted in favor of it. Nobody voted against, and 8 didn't vote. Among Republicans in the state Senate, none of them supported it, 8 voted against it, and 9 didn't vote. And then over on the state Senate side, there's a sort of similar kind of pattern, except not as many people not voting. 31 Democrats voted in favor, none of them voted against. 0 Republicans voted in favor, none of them, all of them voted against, 8. But it still reached the requisite 2/3 support, and so that's how it wound up on the ballot. So what are the primary policy changes if Proposition 5 passes? Well, if Proposition 5 passes, as I was saying before, it'll amend the California Constitution to lower the voter approval requirement for certain local bonds that fund affordable housing and public infrastructure from 2/3 to 55%. And that's basically the key policy change. And for those, some people understand this, for some who don't, let me go into a little bit more detail. Currently, local governments need a 2/3 majority to pass general obligation bonds that raise property taxes to fund projects like affordable housing and infrastructure. What Proposition 5 would do if it passed is it would lower that threshold to 55%, making it easier to secure voter approval for these kinds of bond measures. Now, there's already a 55% threshold on like school facility bonds. This would now apply to both housing and infrastructure bonds. If this passes, local governments would be likely to propose more bond measures aimed at financing affordable housing projects. With a lower threshold, a higher percentage of those measures are expected to pass, resulting in increased local investment in housing for low-income residents and for vulnerable populations like seniors and veterans. It would also lead to increased investment in public infrastructure. Proposition 5 would facilitate the approval of bonds for public infrastructure projects, including roads, fire stations, libraries, and water treatment facilities. This could lead to improvements in local infrastructure benefiting public services and communities. There would also be enhanced oversight. Local governments using bond funds, for housing and infrastructure would need to comply with enhanced oversight measures, including an annual independent financial and performance audit. And once again, as I mentioned in one of the previous propositions, the establishment of a citizens oversight committee to ensure that the bonds are spent appropriately and efficiently. Now, what would be the fiscal impact of Proposition 5 passing? Proposition 5 is expected to make it easier for local governments to pass general obligation bonds for affordable housing and public infrastructure, again, roads, fire stations, water facilities, by lowering the voter approval threshold from 2/3 to 55%. Now, based on past local elections, the legislative analyst estimates that between 20 and 50% more bond measures would have been approved in the past if the threshold was 55%. In other words, local bond measures lost, even though they had a majority support, because in order for them to pass, they needed a 2/3 majority, and they didn't rise to that level. If this proposition passes, local governments could raise several billion dollars in new bond funds to finance housing and infrastructure projects, providing they receive the 55% support of voters. This could, since these kind of bonds are repaid through property taxes, property taxes could increase to cover the cost of the additional borrowing by local governments. The exact impact on property taxes would depend on the number of bonds that were passed and the size of the bond measure, so it's not clear. There's a lot of uncertainty in predicting the impact on local governments. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated. The availability of state funds, which could be used to match or supplement the bond revenues, may influence how much local governments will ultimately spend on housing and infrastructure. Some localities might borrow more, while others might rely on Proposition 5 funds to reduce the need for local revenues. So the legislative analysts said it's sort of hard to know. Local governments would also incur costs related to enhanced oversight requirements like the independent audits, citizens oversight committees. All these are likely to be very small relative to the bond amounts. In the long run, the increase in funding for affordable housing and infrastructure could have broad economic benefits by improving housing availability and maintaining essential public services. However, these long-term benefits could come with increased local debt and taxpayer obligations. Since state finances are largely unaffected, as this measure really deals with local bond measures and doesn't involve increased state-level borrowing. The arguments in favor of Proposition 5 are as follows. Proposition 5 will help address California's housing crisis by making it easier to fund affordable housing projects. The current 2/3 voter threshold is too high, blocking the necessary local bond measures. Lowering the threshold to 55% would allow communities to more easily finance housing projects for low-income residents, seniors, veterans, and give local governments more flexibility in meeting the urgent housing and infrastructure needs. The current threshold gives 1/3 of the people the ability to prevent local communities from addressing these needs. The measure would also facilitate investment in critical public infrastructure such as roads, fire stations, water treatment facilities, improving public safety and services. The proposition includes annual financial audits and the creation of a citizens oversight committee to ensure that the bonds are spent properly, efficiently. And then finally, increasing the funding for housing infrastructure. Housing and infrastructure is expected to create jobs at the local level, stimulate local economy, and improve living conditions, particularly in underserved communities. The arguments against Proposition 5 are as follows. Lowering voter approval threshold will lead to higher property taxes as local governments would be able to pass more bond measures. This would place additional financial burden on homeowners, particularly in regions that already face high taxes and high housing costs. The 2/3 net threshold that currently exists is a necessary safeguard to prevent irresponsible borrowing. By lowering the threshold, Proposition 5 could lead to an excessive borrowing by local governments, increasing long-term debt and interest payments, which would be passed on to future generations. Also, it's unclear the effectiveness of this. Increasing local funding through bonds does not guarantee that housing and infrastructure problems will be effectively addressed. The measure might lead to inefficient use of funds that don't solve the housing problem or don't address infrastructure problems. While Proposition 5 makes it easier to pass bonds, it doesn't ensure that the projects will be completed quickly or provide immediate relief for the current housing crisis. And additionally, without significant state oversight, there's no guarantee that local governments would go ahead and spend money, raise and spend money efficiently. In terms of the organizations that we provided in the other videos, this one falls pretty clearly along the liberal conservative lines. The California Republican Party, the Chamber of Commerce, and the Los Angeles Daily News recommend a no vote. The California Democratic Party, the California Labor Federation, and the Los Angeles Times recommend a yes vote. So what does a vote mean on Proposition 5? A yes vote would support lowering the vote threshold from 2/3 to 55% for local bond measures to fund housing projects and public infrastructure. A no vote opposes lowering the threshold from 2/3 to 55%, keeping it intact what currently exists for local bond measures funding housing projects and public infrastructure. I hope this was helpful.